The Medlock Post.
Radio.
The Medlock Post with Richard G. Medlock begins right now.
Welcome to the Medlock Post radio show. This is where we educate, entertain, enlighten, and empower. The views and opinions on the Medlock Post radio show are those of the host and guests. They are not necessarily the views and opinions of Blog Talk Radio, Spreaker.com, its corporations, affiliates, or any other podcast streaming services. And here is your host, Richard G. Medlock.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. The system has changed a little bit. We kind of got off to a rocky start. Anyway, we the people are one nation under God. Welcome to the Medlock Post. I'm Richard G. Medlock, your host. And this is July 28, 2023. Now, I don't know about where you live, but today we dropped below 14 hours of sunlight from sunset to sunrise to sunset. So the seasons are changing. We'll talk about that on our climate episode, which is coming. It's being put together. You'll really like it. Episode 169 is Ayn Rand, Part 2. Yes, episode 168 was Ayn Rand, Part 1. Now, again, let me go back. When I started episode 168, I read this one-sentence statement. The credibility of the United States judicial system will be either maintained or destroyed today in a Delaware courtroom. Now, since then, I need to add this. The federal judge in Delaware understood the difference between the rule of law and ruler's law. The judge upheld the credibility of the United States judicial system by upholding the rule of law. Hallelujah. Now, you're watching it play out. You're seeing a lot of people scrambling right now. So let them scramble. Inflation came out this morning, and guess what, folks? Inflation is still going up. It's slowed, but it's still going up. It's not retracting. When they say, oh, it only went up 0.2%, that's adding on top of the 20 plus 25% we've already had added under the inflation since it started 3 years ago. All right, 2 years ago. That's done. Ayn Rand. Before we get started in today's discussion concerning Ayn Rand, please understand that she understood human nature like our founding fathers understood human nature. She understood the genius of the Constitution as did the founding fathers, and that it was written to control human nature no matter what the future held or the advances in technology. You will see and understand that better during today's discussion. In episode 168, we talked about the five reasons why she loved America. So let's get going here. Heard me say this one before. Ayn Rand. The exponents of modern movements do not seek to convert you to their values. They haven't any, but to destroy yours. Nihilism and destruction are almost explicit goals of today's trends, and the horror is that these trends move on unopposed. She saw this. She had experience. She experienced Marxism at its fullest when it took over Russia in 1917. Her family their fortune and everything disappeared, taken away from them when she was 12 years old. And she was able to escape and come to America in 1926 at the age of 21. So let's shift from her loving America, and she still does in this, but Carrie J. Byrne, continuing with him, helping me with this outline. 5 ways Ayn Rand predicted America's political crisis, from parents spurned to the rise of cancel culture. Atlas Shrugged author saw that growing influence of rotten ideas would create rotten outcomes, and social upheaval. Many foundational pillars of society in the United States appear to be crumbling right now before our eyes, weakened by an erosive array of social, economic, and political forces. The deterioration of traditional cultural norms and the social upheaval that's followed from the living room to classroom to boardroom is no surprise to Ayn Rand scholars. The celebrated Russian-born American author and philosopher predicted with haunting accuracy many of the nation's current crises. Among her observations, government would encroach on parental rights, stifle academic and scientific research, and fuel a dangerous mentality of victimhood. And all of these things we have talked about on this program. Yaron Brook, the chairman of the California-based Ayn Rand Institute, and it's AynRand.org. I gave you the wrong website the other day. She understood that history is moved by ideas, and if you have rotten ideas, you have rotten outcomes. Period. We see that, not only in government or society, but just a person. You know, kids are playing, and one kid comes up with an idea that just turns out rotten because it's a rotten idea. The fact that she saw a troubled future, she understood that culture, society, and politics are shaped by philosophy, and when we saw the philosophical trends of the 1940s and 1950s, Ayn Rand knew where it would eventually lead. That was in her movement of communism in America. She lived communism, and in the 40s and 50s is when communism started rearing its ugly head, more so in America. Remember we talked about the naked communist and the 47 goals for communists to take over America? That came out in 1958. She wrote Atlas Shrugged, came out in 1957. But she could see these trends happening. She was studying America. She was studying society and government and everything else. She knew she could make a difference. The fact that she saw a troubled future amid this euphoric post-World War II glow of America's global hegemony makes her insight even more remarkable. And she and others that I have quoted, program from the 50s and 60s and 70s, were on the same page. Yaron Brook said she understood that history is moved by ideas and rotten ideas. I've already read that. And she always goes back to the original founding principles set forth by the founding fathers. That was her basis. Is it your basis? We'll see here. It should be. And we've covered it multiple times since we started this program June 15th, 2022. Even her biggest fans might be surprised at her prescient insight into the state of America today. All right, her first insight, number one. Rand foresaw America's tragic failures in education. Really? Centralized educational bureaucracy has reached deeply into local education in recent decades, to the quantifiable detriment of the system and the nation's school children. The creation of the Federal Department of Education in 1979, to cite one example, has been followed by a massive reduction in the number of local school districts and local power over education. Another example is the National Education Association, that the union that controls the teachers. Promise of centralized education took money out of local communities, funded a massive bureaucracy, and gave back pennies on the dollar, but with the authority to influence local policy through federal purse strings. Everyone knows that American schools are failing, that they cannot even teach children to read, said Yaron Brook. And that is true, folks. And you know it, and everybody else knows it. And even those at the NEA and others know it, because that's what they want, a dumbed-down populace that will believe whatever the government tells them. Let's go back to the money aspect. I've said for many, 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 many years that the federal government figured out how to get the states on federal welfare, doling out money to them. Education was the first way that they started doing that. The roads were the other. Once they got control of education, it's been downhill since. And that was in the 1970s, the Department of Education in 1979, but it had started prior to that in 1970 when the Supreme Court ruled to do away with segregation. Now, but hold on, folks. Don't take that wrong. The ruling was good. However, how it was carried out in the schools was terrible. And has been a disaster. It is no surprise that kids grow up feeling anxious, helpless, and act out, and that parents are frustrated. The problem goes back more than a century to the injection of a corrupt philosophical approach to education, and Ayn Rand exposed this problem long ago. In the early 1900s, when Marxism was coming into the United States and politicians and educators were falling under its mystical whim, they removed Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, started taking that out of universities and putting in Karl Marx, The Communist Manifesto. And that was in the early 1900s in this country, over 100 years ago. Another reason, the second reason Ayn Rand predicted the future. Rand warned against government encroaching in parental rights and authority. Wow. Dead on, right? Government has stepped between parents and children in ways Americans until recently never dreamed possible. I saw the other day in California that the courts took a child away from the parents because she would not allow them to attend classes at school teaching transgenderism and other garbage. So the government took her child away. That's Marxist. Ayn Rand said, the government has no right to interfere in the upbringing of a child, which is entirely the responsibility and the right of the parent. School boards and bureaucrats openly silence parents trying to maintain a voice in public education. Legislators are actively working to remove parents from making life-altering medical decisions for their children. I just talked about one. Ayn Rand said this in Ayn Rand on campus, and this was in 1962. Since the child is dependent for survival on the parents, the government can see to it that the child's life is safe. But this does not extend to intellectual issues. Only physical safety. The government, she added, has no right to interfere in the upbringing of a child, which is entirely the responsibility and the right of the parent. Number 3, Ayn Rand predicted the intellectual dangers of victimhood. Intellectual dangers. Understand that phrase. American culture once prized the universality of a potential. Anyone can succeed regardless of identity. Disparities in results are irrefutable, but the successes of maximized opportunity for everyone in America are irrefutable too. People of all races, creeds, and colors flooded the world's greatest immigrant nation to chase opportunity they did not have at home and still do today. The rise of victimhood culture has erased this opportunity for millions of Americans. And this goes back, ladies and gentlemen, to the great deal of Franklin Roosevelt. This great deal of his to help people, literally put people on social welfare. And she saw that. And a lot of people did back then, but they didn't have the spine to stand up for it or against it. It's convinced them that society is helplessly stacked against them. Effort is futile, and dependence is freedom. Let me read that sentence again. Victimhood has convinced people that society is hopelessly stacked against them. Effort is futile, and dependence is freedom. Dependence is not freedom. Dependence is slavery. She wrote 1971 anthology, The New Left, The Anti-American Revolution. She wrote this: the Academia Jet Set Coalition is attempting to tame the American character by the deliberate breeding of helplessness and resignation in those incubators of lethargy known as progressive schools. This is in 1971. It's still happening today. The Academia Jet Set Coalition is attempting, no, they have tamed the American character by the deliberate breeding of helplessness and resignation. Don't worry about it, folks. The government will take care of you. No problem. These schools, she added, are dedicated to the task of crippling a child's mind by arresting his cognitive development. And that means They don't know how to think. They've taken their reason away from them, their power to reason, their power to think, the power to be their own selves. They've taken away that from people by creating them as victims. Yaron Brook wrote about this. Equality of outcomes is an evil idea. It's a metaphysically impossible idea. And he said that in his 2016 book, Equal is Unfair, America's Misguided Fight Against Income Inequality. Now, let's go back to her, The New Left, the Anti-American Revolution. Now, I'm going to put that up on my blog today, or well, hopefully I get it done today. If not, it'll be up by tomorrow. But I want to address a couple there. But let's go into that just a little bit. The 60s, this is Ayn Rand from The New Left, the Anti-American Left. I forgot the name. Where are you? The Anti-American Revolution. Now, those of us that grew up in the 60s and 70s are fully aware of that statement. So I'm going to help you understand that better. The 60s usually glorified as a time when America's youth stood up in rebellion against the cultural establishment, protesting everything from Vietnam to industrial capitalism. Industrial capitalism, free market. College students, under the banner of the New Left, forcibly occupied campus buildings and idealized Ho Chi Minh and Fidel Castro, two big communists of the time, and were hailed as idealistic revolutionaries. Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam and Fidel Castro in Cuba. Ayn Rand viewed them very differently. In a number of essays, she analyzes the campus protest and the ideology of the New Left, concluding that far from rebelling, they were slavishly following every basic idea of their teachers, and that far from being idealistic, they were attacking the key foundations of a rational, free society. And I fully agree with that statement that she made in 1971 because I was there, I saw it, I lived it, I witnessed it, and I understood, many of us understood what those protestings were doing. They were protesting against America. They wanted to destroy America. And many of those that protested and were part of that anti-American revolution became government leaders, and some are still sitting in office today. And Bill and Hillary Clinton were part of that. And so was Joe Biden. Rand's writings on these and related topics were collected in The New Left, the Anti-Industrial Revolution. Again, Anti-Industrial Revolution. In 1999 edition, Return to the Primitive, added supplemental articles including Free by editor Peter Schwartz, analyzing the New Left's enduring legacy, which I just explained to you, and I've explained many, many times. There are 5 areas Ayn Rand discusses in the New Left, the Anti-American Revolution. They are 1, environmentalism. 2, freedom of speech. 3, progressive education. 4, emotionalism. 5, reason. I want to focus on 2 of them. Emotionalism. And as we go through this, you're going to see, wow. In one of Ayn Rand's most fascinating cultural commentaries, Apollo and Dionysus, She explains two historic events from 1969, the Woodstock Music Festival and the launch of Apollo 11 to the moon. From salient facts about these two events and the culture's response, Rand draws implications applicable not just to the 60s hippies, but to any individual in any era. In her analysis, these two events expressed and dramatized an issue of profound philosophical importance: the alleged conflict between reason and emotion. She writes, "It is not true that reason and emotion are irreconcilable antagonists, or that emotions are a wild, unknowable, ineffable element in men. But that is what emotions become for those who do not care to know what they feel and who attempt to subordinate reason to their emotions." Folks, this is exactly what the Marxists have done in this country. They have got people making emotional decisions, doing everything based on emotions and not reason. We see this every day out there in America. And reason has become subordinate to emotions. Again, I go back. Go up to someone out there protesting for transgenderism and ask them, why are you protesting? Why are you supporting this? They cannot answer you one question that you ask them. They'll walk away. So, she hit the nail on the head in 1971. She understood human nature. That was emotionalism. Now let's see what she said about reason. As a cultural commentator, Ayn Rand is not primarily interested in denunciation, though she found much to denounce in the ideas and events dominating America at the time. Much more important to her is the projection of a positive idea to the elaboration of her philosophy, objectivism, as the alternative we should embrace. In Rand's view, the fundamental antidote to the emotionalism and irrationalism of the hippie student rebels of the New Left is a proper understanding of reason. This is what she set out to accomplish. She writes, "I am not primarily an advocate of capitalism, but of egoism." Now, hold on to yourself there. Don't go panicked. "And I am not primarily an advocate of egoism, but of reason. If one recognizes the supremacy of reason and applies it consistently, all the rest follows. This, the supremacy of reason, was, is, and will be the primary concern of my work and the essence of objectivism. Common sense. Common sense and reason tells you a free capitalistic market is much better than a government-controlled market. Common sense and reason tells you that allowing someone to have free speech, free think, control their own intellectual progress and understanding is better than the government having you dumb and making decisions on emotions and not reason. This is objectivism, and a lot of people, they don't study it enough to say, hey, that's really a good idea, because it's the idea that the founding fathers and Adam Smith and Cicero and John Locke and others talked about, freedom. And they mentioned the word reason in their writings too. Number 4, Rand warned that ever larger government would stifle intellectual freedom. Have you ever put those two together? Ever larger government would stifle intellectual freedom? Well, let's see how she put that together. Science, academia, and the arts have become increasingly dependent on government largesse in recent decades. Intellectual and creative freedom that made the United States a global leader in research and popular culture has been replaced by conformity. Ayn Rand said in a 1976 lecture, "Government grants to the arts are a horror. They make it harder for artists who lack political pull and do not share in contemporary aesthetic taste." She abhorred the government getting involved in anything except protection of rights. She continued, "No whim is more ugly and revolting than the aesthetic whim of some bureaucrat. All an artist can do in this context is to be a spiritual bootlicker." Now that's a Russian phrase, bootlicker. A Russian communist phrase. The danger to science is something else again. She continued, "The government has created a situation wherein there is little private industry research. Therefore, scientists have no choice but to apply for government grants." If you listen to my episode 167, where I talked about my presidential platform, all government subsidies are done. They're open, no more. Grants, subsidies, whatever. The dangers of government-controlled research became brutally apparent during the COVID-19 pandemic, when lives and careers were destroyed simply for challenging politically motivated policies passed off as science. Aaron Brooke wrote, psychologically, this is the cultural atmosphere of a society living under censorship. And we saw it and are still seeing, continuing to see that censorship today. I'm still getting censored. So are many of my colleagues. Number 5. Rand argued capitalism would perish in a society cowed by cancel culture. American-style capitalism produced wealth and opportunity never before imagined in human history. Rand argued that leftists of her time were morally corrupt for advocating utopian philosophies and pushing the United States toward statism. And folks, we're almost there to statism. But she was even more critical of conservatives and traditionalists who failed to stand up and fight back. And we are still critical of them today. She appeared to predict that they would be cowed by public pressure, or what we now call cancel culture. I can remember when Republicans were afraid to say anything because the media would just rip them apart. They cowed to that cancel culture. She continued, "Capitalism is what the conservatives dare not advocate or defend," she said. "They are paralyzed by the profound conflict between capitalism and the moral code which dominates our culture, the morality of altruism." And we talked about that in episode 168. You had two choices. You go back and pull that up. You need to hear this again. I'm looking, I pulled up the script for the last one. Ayn Rand. Today, the conflict has reached its ultimate climax. The choice is clear-cut. Either a new morality of rational self-interest with its consequence of freedom, justice, progress, and man's happiness on earth, or the primordial morality of altruism with its consequences of slavery, brute force, stagnant terror, and sacrificial furnaces. And she repeated that again here. The power of political altruism, the belief that government can provide happiness, has only grown in the decades that have followed. She said, altruism holds that man has no right to exist for his own sake, that service to others is the only justification of his existence, and that self-sacrifice is his highest moral duty, virtue, and value. Under altruism, ladies and gentlemen, you self-sacrifice to the government, to the dictators, and you serve them and whoever else they tell you to serve. She sensed that the fight between capitalism and altruism could tear apart the United States of America, and she was 100% correct. She said, capitalism and altruism are incompatible. They cannot coexist in the same man or in the same society. Now that reminds me of the scriptures. No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God. You cannot serve God and mammon, which is man. These are the things that we talk about, we try to make you aware of. And Ayn Rand was on top of this. She was one of many that were on top of this. Now, this is something a little different. This is from Objectivism. Advancing your potential. Ayn Rand wrote volumes urging people to be selfish. Well, hold on. Ayn Rand said, I can be selfish. But let's look. What? Aren't people already too selfish? Just do whatever you feel like? Be a thoughtless jerk and exploit people to get ahead? Easy, right? Except, I'm reading Ayn Rand, except that acting thoughtlessly and victimizing others, Rand claims, is not in your self-interest. What Ayn Rand advocates is an approach to life that's unlike anything you've ever heard before. Now, it is supported by other things, Christianity and other things. Selfishness in her philosophy means follow reason, not whims. Work hard to achieve a life of purpose and productiveness. Earn genuine self-esteem. Earn it, she says. Pursue your own happiness as your highest moral aim. Prosper by treating others as individuals trading value for value. That comes down to a win-win situation, folks. At the dawn of our lives, writes Rand, we seek a noble vision of man's nature and of life's potential. Rand's philosophy is that vision. Explore it for yourself. And that, folks, is the Medlock Post for today, July 28, 2023. May God bless America.